The scent of ash and victory hung heavy in the air. Troy, the impregnable city with towering walls, was now a feast for crows and flames. The Greeks, victorious after 10 long years of siege, celebrated among the ruins of the city they had conquered, not by brute force, but by the cunning of a single man. At the heart of the celebration, but with his mind a world away, stood Odysseus, king of rugged Ithaca. It was he, the man of 1,000 wiles, who had conceived the ruse of the colossal wooden horse. While his men drank wine and sang of their exploits, Odysseus's gaze drifted toward the purple horizon of the Aegean Sea. He no longer longed for gold or glory. His entire soul yearned for return. He dreamed of the embrace of his faithful wife, Penelope, and of seeing the face of the son he had left as a child, Telemachus. The war was over. Everyone believed the hard part was done. With sails swollen by a wind that promised a swift return, the fleet of 12 ships set out at dawn. 12 proud vessels, loaded with the treasures of Troy, and with men whose only desire was to once again kiss their homeland soil. Odysseus, standing at the prow of his flagship, felt a surge of hope, a warmth in his chest that came not only from the rising sun. "Homeward bound!" he shouted, and the roar of his men echoed over the waves. But the sea is no obedient servant, and the gods of Olympus are fickle. They had smiled upon the Greeks during the war, but the arrogance of the victors had offended some immortals, one in particular. The journey home would not be a straight line, but a labyrinth drawn by divine wrath. The first trial was about to be unleashed, a storm born not of nature, but of pure and sacred fury. The sky, once a promising blue, turned a purplish black in a matter of moments. The wind, which had whispered of home, now roared like a wounded beast. Waves the size of hills rose from nowhere, crashing against the fragile wooden ships. The rain didn't fall. It hurled itself in blinding, icy sheets. The men, veterans of 1,000 land battles, clung to masts and rails, their faces pale with a terror no Trojan sword had ever inspired. Odysseus, soaked and struggling to stay upright, shouted orders that the howling wind devoured and scattered into chaos. He watched in horror as one of his ships was swallowed by a monstrous wave, vanishing into a whirl of foam and splintered wood. Then another and another. The treasure of Troy, the pride of their victory, sank into the bottomless depths, a useless offering to the insatiable sea. For 9 days and 9 nights, the storm dragged them mercilessly across the waters. They lost all sense of direction, the sun and stars hidden behind an impenetrable shroud of clouds. The men were exhausted, their hands raw, their spirits broken. When, on the 10th day, the fury of the sky finally subsided, a pale sun revealed a desolate sight. Of the once proud fleet of 12 ships, only Odysseus's vessel remained, battered and drifting in an unknown sea. Weary and drained, they spotted a nearby shore. It was a lush land, peaceful in appearance, a vision of paradise after the hell they had endured. Without knowing where they were or who dwelled on that coast, their need for fresh water and rest drove them to row toward it. They docked in a quiet bay, never imagining that the danger awaiting them would not come from storms or monsters, but from a flower of sweet and terrible forgetfulness. They had arrived in the land of the Lotus-Eaters. The island was a deception to the senses. Streams of crystal-clear water wound through meadows of impossibly vibrant green, and a gentle breeze carried the intoxicating scent of exotic flowers. For Odysseus' men, survivors of the storm, the place seemed like a divine reward. Ever cautious, Odysseus ordered most of his men to stay on the beach to repair the ship and regain their strength. He sent 3 of his best scouts to find out who the island's inhabitants were and whether they were friend or foe. The scouts ventured into the island and found no hostile warriors or fortified cities, only a people who were languid and smiling, their eyes lost in a perpetual dream. The Lotus-Eaters welcomed them kindly and, as a gesture of hospitality, offered their most treasured delicacy, the sweet and sticky lotus flower. Tired and hungry, the men accepted the gift without hesitation. At the first bite, a warm and honeyed fog flooded their minds. The memory of war, the pain of the storm, the longing for Ithaca, the image of their wives and children, all dissolved like salt in water. An overwhelming, hollow happiness overtook them, and their only desire in the world was to remain there forever, eating that wondrous flower. Time passed, and the scouts did not return. A dark premonition gripped Odysseus's heart. Leaving his second-in-command in charge of the ship, he set out to find them himself. He found them sitting among the Lotus-Eaters, vacant smiles on their faces, lazily plucking lotus petals with listless fingers. When Odysseus ordered them to return, they looked at him without recognition, murmuring that they had already found their home. There was no time for persuasion. Odysseus realized the terrible magic of the plant. With the help of the men who had come with him, he had to drag the 3 scouts back by force, carrying them to the ship as they wept and begged to be left in their paradise of forgetfulness. He tied them tightly to the rowing benches and, with a heavy heart, gave the command to depart at once, fleeing from a peace more dangerous than any war. The next land they reach will not be so welcoming. They sailed on with the bitter taste of fear and loss still on their tongues. The next shore they sighted was the polar opposite of the land of the Lotus-Eaters. It was an island of jagged cliffs and solitary peaks, a wild, lawless land that seemed untouched by human hands. There were no ports, no cultivated fields, only untamed nature and an ominous silence. They anchored in a sheltered bay. While most of the crew rested, the insatiable curiosity of Odysseus, that blend of boldness and pride that was both his greatest virtue and his deepest flaw, drove him to explore. What kind of beings lived in such an uncivilized land? He chose his 12 best men and filled a leather wineskin with a particularly strong and sweet wine, a treasure from Ismarus so potent it had to be mixed with 20 parts water. It was a gift worthy of a king, or a weapon to bring down an enemy. With this precaution, they ventured into the island. Soon they found what they were looking for, an enormous cave, more like a cavern carved into the mountainside, with an entrance tall enough for a giant to pass through. Inside, baskets full of cheeses the size of shields were stacked to the ceiling, and stone pens held lambs and young goats. It was clearly the home of a shepherd, but one of inhuman proportions. His men, anxious, pleaded with him, "Lord, let us take some cheese and lambs and flee back to the ship before the owner returns. Who knows what beast lives here?" But Odysseus refused. Tradition dictated that a host must offer gifts to their guests, and his pride longed to look upon the face of the owner of such a colossal dwelling. He wanted to measure the creature and receive the gift of hospitality he felt he deserved. So they lit a fire, made an offering to the gods, and waited. It was the greatest mistake of their journey. At sunset, the ground trembled under the weight of thunderous footsteps. A massive shadow fell across the cave's entrance, blocking the light of the setting sun. A one-eyed monster, a cyclops, stooped to enter, driving in his flock. And with a roar that sealed their fate, he rolled a massive stone to close the entrance, trapping them in the darkness of Polyphemus's lair. The crash of the boulder sealing the entrance echoed like a death sentence. The fire they had lit now served only to illuminate the colossal figure of their captor and the terrified faces of the men. The air thickened with the sour animal stench of the giant, who studied them with his single massive eye, a wet, lashless orb gleaming with cruel intelligence. "Strangers," his voice boomed, making the cave walls tremble. Who are you? Merchants, or perhaps pirates who roam the seas, risking your lives to bring misery to others? Odysseus, suppressing the knot of ice forming in his gut, stepped forward. The survival of all depended on his words. We are not pirates, my lord. We are Achaeans, returning from the great war of Troy, blown off course by winds and waves. We throw ourselves at your mercy and beg your hospitality in the name of Zeus, god of travelers, who punishes those who deny aid to strangers. The Cyclops let out a laugh like thunder cracking through the mountains. Fool, do you think the Cyclops fear your gods? We care nothing for Zeus or any of your Olympian immortals. We are far stronger than they are. His eye settled on the men with a calculating, hungry stare. But tell me, where have you left your ship, so I may go and see it? Sensing the trap in the question, Odysseus answered with the first lie that would save their lives. Our ship was shattered against the rocks of this coast by Poseidon, the earth-shaker. Only we survived. Polyphemus said no more. With terrifying speed for one so massive, he lunged forward and seized two of Odysseus's men by the ankles. Before their companions could react, he smashed them against the stone floor like puppies, shattering their skulls. Without pause, he tore them apart and devoured them limb by limb, washing down the grisly feast with fresh milk. A murderous rage blinded Odysseus. His hand flew to the hilt of his sword, ready to plunge it into the monster's belly as he slept. But a cold thought stayed his hand. If he killed the beast, who would move the massive stone blocking the exit? They would all die there, in that stinking tomb. Heartbroken with grief and helplessness, Odysseus knew brute force was not the answer. He would have to wait. He would have to think. His life and the lives of the men he had left depended on a trick yet to be conceived. Dawn came without comfort, only the grayish light seeping through the cracks in the stone. They awoke to the thunderous noise of Polyphemus rising. Without a word, the monster repeated his horrific morning ritual. He seized two more men, killed them brutally, and devoured them for breakfast. Then, with insulting ease, he rolled the stone aside, led his flock to pasture, and sealed the entrance once again, leaving the survivors in tears and despair. But in the heart of Odysseus, pain was hardening into cold, sharp determination. While his men wept, he scanned the cave, searching for anything that could serve as a weapon. And then he saw it. Leaning against the wall was an olive tree trunk, still green, which the Cyclops had cut and left to dry to use as a walking stick. It was as thick and long as the mast of a 20-oared ship. A bold and terrible plan began to take shape in his mind. "Men," he called, his firm voice slicing through the sobs. "Enough crying. Tears won't move that stone. Help me." Under his command, they cut a piece of the trunk about 2 meters long. They smoothed it and sharpened one end to a fine, lethal point. Then, to harden it, they thrust it into the embers of the fire until the wood glowed with deadly heat, nearly bursting into flame. Once prepared, they hid the giant stake beneath a pile of dung that covered the cave floor. The next step was the riskiest. He would need help to wield the weapon. "Let us draw lots," said Odysseus, "to see which of you will have the courage to help me drive this stake into the Cyclops' eye once the wine has taken hold." Fortune fell upon 4 of his strongest and bravest men, the very ones he would have chosen. With the 5 of them, the team was ready. All that remained was to await the monster's return. At sunset, Polyphemus came back. This time he brought his entire flock into the cave, not just the youngest. After sealing the entrance, he set about preparing his dinner. Odysseus's heart pounded against his ribs, his hand clutching the wineskin. Night was falling, and with it, blood or freedom. The giant wasted no time. He grabbed 2 more of my unfortunate companions, killed them with the same horrifying ease, and devoured them for dinner. A sepulchral silence filled the cave, broken only by the crunch of bones and the sound of flesh being torn apart. When the monster finished his gruesome feast, Odysseus, his heart pounding like a war drum but his face calm, stepped forward holding the wineskin. "Cyclops," he said firmly, "since you've dined on human flesh, now taste this wine and see what kind of drink our ship carried. I offer it to you as a gift, in the hope that you'll take pity and help me return home." Polyphemus took the wineskin and drank a long, deep draught. The sweet and potent liquor, pure and undiluted, delighted him instantly. A savage grin spread across his face. "Give me more, stranger, this is delicious, and tell me your name right now so I can give you a gift of hospitality you'll never forget." Odysseus, feeling the pieces of his plan falling into place, served him again and again. The giant drank 3 times, draining the entire wineskin, his single eye glazed and unfocused from the drink. "You ask for my noble name," said Odysseus, his mind sharp as a blade. "I'll tell you, and you'll give me the gift you promised. My name is Nobody. My mother, my father, and all my companions call me Nobody." The Cyclops burst into a stupid, drunken laugh. "Well then, Nobody, my gift to you shall be this: I'll eat you last, after all your friends." With that, the giant collapsed backward, falling into a deep, drunken sleep. From his throat came a thunderous snore, and from his mouth spilled a mix of wine and chunks of human flesh. The time had come. With his men, Odysseus pulled the stake from beneath the dung. They placed the tip in the embers until the olive wood, though still green, glowed a terrible red, nearly bursting into flame. The moment of vengeance had arrived. Summoning all their courage, Odysseus and his 4 companions lifted the heavy stake. They positioned themselves around the sleeping giant's head, aiming the glowing tip directly at the center of his single monstrous eye. With a muffled war cry, Odysseus gave the signal, and they all pushed with the strength of desperation. The eyeball sizzled at the touch of the red-hot wood, like a blacksmith's blade plunged into cold water. A horrific stench of burning flesh and hair filled the cave. The Cyclops awoke with a scream of pure, thunderous agony. A sound so terrible that the men recoiled in fear, retreating into the shadows to hide. Blind and howling in pain, Polyphemus ripped the smoldering stake from his empty socket and hurled it aside. He rose to his feet, swinging his massive arms like windmills, trying to catch his tormentors. But in the darkness, and now without his sight, he struck only air and stone. His cries of rage and suffering echoed across the island, rousing the other Cyclopes from the nearby caves. Soon, voices could be heard calling to him from outside the stone. "Polyphemus, what's happening? Why do you wake us with these screams in the middle of the night? Is some mortal stealing your flock, or trying to kill you by trickery or force?" From inside the cave, the blind monster howled back his fateful reply. "Friends, nobody is killing me with trickery. Nobody is killing me by force." The Cyclopes outside paused, confused. "Well then," they shouted back, "if nobody is hurting you, there's nothing we can do. It must be a sickness sent by great Zeus. Pray to our father Poseidon." And with that, they left him, alone in his agony. In the darkness, Odysseus smiled for the first time. His cunning had saved them from certain death. But the smile faded quickly. They were alive, yes, but the immense stone still blocked the exit, and a blind, furious, wounded monster now sat at the entrance, ready to seize them if they tried to flee. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the need for a new plan. They spent the rest of the night crouched in the deepest corner of the cave, listening to Polyphemus's groans and curses. When the first rays of light filtered through the cracks, the giant, despite his excruciating pain, rose to carry out his morning routine. He rolled aside the great stone to let his flock out to graze. But he was no fool. He sat at the threshold, blocking the exit with his massive body, and stretched out his hands to feel the back of every sheep and ram that passed, making sure none of his prisoners attempted to escape riding on them. From the darkness, Odysseus watched his every move, his mind racing feverishly. He saw the rams, large, sturdy animals with thick, woolly fleeces that hung almost to the ground. And in that wool, he saw their only desperate chance at salvation. Quickly and silently, he shared his plan with his terrified men. Using the supple willow rods the Cyclops used for weaving baskets, Odysseus tied the rams together in groups of 3. Beneath the belly of the middle ram, hidden between the other 2 and the dense fleece, he bound each of his men. This way, when the monster felt over their backs, he would only touch the wool of the beasts. For himself, Odysseus chose the finest ram in the flock, a magnificent animal, the leader, with a fleece so thick it was like a cloak. He did not tie himself. Instead, he clung with hands and feet to the wool beneath the ram's belly, hanging upside down, praying to the gods that his strength would not fail him. One by one, the trios of rams, with their precious human cargo hidden beneath, began to walk toward the exit. The men held their breath as Polyphemus's giant hands passed over the backs of the animals, carrying them to freedom. Odysseus' heart pounded furiously as his own ram approached the threshold. The monster was about to touch the very animal that bore him. Life or death now hung, quite literally, by a fleece of wool. The great ram moved forward slowly, as if it could feel the weight of its human burden and the fate it carried. Polyphemus's enormous hands rested on its back. The monster stopped the animal. Odysseus's heart froze. He could hear the Cyclops' wheezing breath just above him. "My dear ram," the giant murmured, his voice, though full of pain, surprisingly tender. "Why are you the last to leave today? Never before have you lagged behind. You were always the first to race toward the soft pastures. Do you feel sorrow for your master's eye, which some wretched scoundrel and his crew have blinded after fooling me with wine? Ah, if only you could think and speak! If you could tell me where that nobody is hiding, so I might vent my fury! I would smash his brains across the floor of this cave." For a moment that felt like an eternity, Polyphemus stroked the ram's wool, his hand just inches from Odysseus's tense body. But, consumed by his grief and convinced that the animal shared his pain, he finally gave it a gentle pat and let it pass. Once they were safely out of the cave's reach, Odysseus let go and dropped to the ground, freeing his men from their wool-bound restraints. Without wasting a second, and despite the danger, they surrounded the thick-legged rams and quickly drove them toward the ship. The crew who had remained behind greeted them with cries of joy that soon turned into wails of grief upon seeing how many men were missing. Odysseus silenced them with a sharp gesture. "There's no time to mourn. Get the livestock aboard and row like your lives depend on it." The men obeyed instantly. They sat at the benches and began to strike the sea with their oars, pulling the ship away from that cursed shore. When they were at a distance they believed safe, Odysseus, driven by pride and uncontainable fury, stood at the stern. He filled his lungs and, against the advice of his men, prepared to shout back at the monster he had outwitted. His need to have the last word would be his undoing. "Cyclops!" he shouted, his voice heavy with bitter triumph as it echoed across the water. "Did you think you could devour the comrades of a coward without consequence? You have received your rightful punishment from the gods and from me for your crimes." The monster, upon hearing the voice that had tormented him, roared with pure rage. Groping blindly, he tore the peak off a nearby hill as if it were a mere clod of earth and hurled it with inhuman strength toward the sound. The colossal boulder crashed into the sea just in front of the prow, raising a towering wave that hurled the ship backward, driving it perilously close to the cursed shore. For a moment, it seemed that all their cunning and suffering had been in vain. His men, their faces pale with panic, rowed with all their might to escape once more, whispering desperate pleas. "Fool, why provoke the beast? He nearly killed us. Row in silence, or he'll drag us all to the depths." But Odysseus's fury and pride burned like a fire that could not be quenched. When they had put more distance between themselves and the shore, he could no longer restrain himself. He shouted again, and this time his words sealed his fate and that of his men for the next decade. "Cyclops, if ever a mortal man asks who blinded you and brought you shame, tell him it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, the son of Laertes, whose home is on Ithaca." At the sound of the name and lineage, Polyphemus let out a groan that seemed to rise from the bowels of the earth. "Woe is me! An ancient prophecy has been fulfilled. Long ago, a seer foretold that I would be blinded by a man named Odysseus, but I expected a warrior of giant stature and divine might, not this puny, cunning wretch." Then the blind giant raised his arms to the star-filled sky, toward the sea that was his father's domain. And with a voice that made the very air tremble, he uttered the curse that would haunt Odysseus across all the seas. "Hear me, Poseidon, earth-shaker, god of the sea with azure hair. If truly I am your son, grant me this. Let Odysseus, the sacker of cities, never return to his home. And if fate has already decreed that he must, let him come late and wretched, having lost all his companions, on a foreign ship, and may he find ruin in his own house." The sea seemed to darken upon hearing the giant's prayer. A cold current swept across the ship, and Odysseus felt the weight of the curse settle on his shoulders like a freezing cloak. Poseidon had heard. Now they were not only fighting the waves and the wind, but the will of a god. They rowed in sepulchral silence, the echo of Odysseus' shout and the ensuing curse ringing in their ears. No one dared look at their king, whose pride had earned them the wrath of the earth-shaker. They sailed for days, always glancing over their shoulders, expecting a vengeful wave to rise from the depths and swallow them whole. At last, they sighted an island unlike any they had ever seen. It floated upon the sea, surrounded by an unbroken wall of solid bronze, from which smooth cliffs rose into the sky. It was Aeolia, the realm of Aeolus, whom Zeus had named Keeper of the Winds. Aeolus received them with a hospitality that stood in brutal contrast to the horror they had just endured. He and his 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, married to one another, lived in a state of eternal feasting. For an entire month, Odysseus and his men rested in his palace, eating and drinking, while Odysseus recounted the fall of Troy and the hardships of their journey. Moved by his tale, Aeolus resolved to help him. On the day of their departure, he gave Odysseus an extraordinary gift, a great leather bag made from the hide of an ox, inside which he had bound all the stormy winds. The furious Boreas of the north, the damp Notus of the south, the violent Eurus of the east, all were trapped, roaring within the hide.
With a shining silver cord, Aeolus tied the bag tightly to the mast of Odysseus' ship. Then he released a single wind, the gentle Zephyrus from the west, and commanded it to blow steadily and unfailingly to carry them home. With the path clear and a favorable wind at their backs, hope returned to the hearts of the crew. For 9 days and 9 nights they sailed without rest. On the 10th day, they were so close they could already see the shores of Ithaca and the smoke rising from its hearths. The journey seemed at last to be over. Ithaca was finally within reach.
Odysseus, who had not let go of the helm nor entrusted the navigation of the ship to anyone for 9 days and 9 nights, was finally overcome by a deep and heavy sleep. His body, pushed to the limit of endurance, gave in at the sight of the land he had longed for so desperately. It was in that moment of vulnerability that misfortune took root. His men, seeing him asleep, began to murmur among themselves, their eyes fixed on the large leather bag tied to the mast. "Look," said one, "he always returns laden with treasures from every land we touch, while we who've suffered just as much go home empty-handed. What gold and silver might Aeolus have gifted him in that tightly guarded bag?" Envy, like a poison, clouded their judgment. They convinced themselves that their king was hiding a fortune from them, the final loot he refused to share. Ignoring any possible consequences, believing they would find only riches inside, they crept toward the bag. While Odysseus slept, dreaming of Penelope's embrace and the face of Telemachus, his men untied the gleaming silver cord. Instantly, all the winds escaped in a furious and chaotic howl. The ship was hurled backward, spinning like a top in the midst of a storm unleashed by their own foolishness. The gentle Zephyr was swallowed up by the fury of his released brothers. Odysseus jolted awake just in time to see the shores of his homeland, the smoke rising from the hearths of Ithaca, vanish on the horizon at an impossible speed. Despair overtook him. For a moment he considered throwing himself overboard, ending his misery in the sea. But instead he covered his face and endured, as the storm, born of his own crew's folly, dragged them mercilessly back into the open sea, away from their destination and toward the very island they had just left behind. The same storm that had driven them away from Ithaca returned them, like a cruel joke of fate, to the floating island of Aeolia. They disembarked, not as heroes on the brink of homecoming, but as fools punished by their own folly. Odysseus appeared before Aeolus with his face covered in shame, followed by his men with lowered heads, not daring to meet anyone's gaze. Aeolus, in the midst of his daily feast, was stunned to see them. "How is it that you have returned?" he asked, his voice stripped of the warmth it once held. "What demon has hunted you down? I gave you everything you needed for a safe return. It is your own wickedness and the madness of your men that brought you back." With a heavy heart, Odysseus told him the truth, the envy of his crew and his own untimely sleep. Aeolus's face hardened into a mask of fury and pious dread. "Out of my sight!" roared the Keeper of the Winds, rising from his throne. "Get off my island, most wretched of all living men! It is not right for me to aid a man whom the immortal gods despise. Your return here is proof that the heavens reject you. Go!" Cast out, and without the aid of any wind, they were forced to return to their oars. For 6 days and 6 nights they rowed with aching limbs and shattered spirits. On the 7th day they sighted a distant land. There they found a magnificent harbor, surrounded by high cliffs that formed an almost perfect circle, with only a single narrow entrance through which ships could pass. The captains of the other 11 ships, relieved to find such a calm and sheltered refuge, guided their vessels into the harbor and moored them close together.
But Odysseus, overcome by a chilling premonition, tied his black ship outside the harbor, lashed to a rock near the entrance. Once settled, he sent 3 of his men as scouts to discover what kind of people lived in that land. They did not know they had just set foot in the realm of the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants for whom men were nothing but prey.
The 3 scouts followed a well-worn path that led them to a spring, where they found a towering young woman drawing water. She was the daughter of Antiphates, the king of the Laestrygonians. When they asked her who ruled that land, she said nothing and silently pointed to the lofty dwelling of her father. With their hearts tight from a growing sense of dread, they made their way to the palace. Upon entering, they were met by the queen, a woman as tall and massive as a mountaintop, whose very presence filled them with immediate terror. She let out a piercing cry, and from the inner chambers came her husband, King Antiphates. Without a word, without offering any hospitality or asking a single question, the giant lunged at one of the scouts, seized him like a rag doll, and tore him in half to prepare for his dinner. The other 2, stricken with terror, fled for their lives, sprinting back toward the harbor in a frenzy, shouting out a desperate warning. But it was already too late. Antiphates had unleashed a howl that echoed through the valley. From the tops of cliffs and behind the rocks, giants emerged from every direction, not like men, but like a plague of monsters. They positioned themselves along the edges of the cliffs surrounding the harbor and began hurling enormous boulders, chunks of mountain that crashed down upon the trapped fleet. The sound of splintering wood, shattering masts, and the screams of dying men was deafening. The ships were crushed and sunk within minutes. Then the giants descended to the shore, and like fishermen, speared the drowning men with long harpoons, dragging them away for their horrific feast. From my position outside the harbor, I watched the massacre in absolute horror. There was nothing I could do to save them. With tears of rage and helplessness streaming down my face, I drew my sword, slashed the ropes binding my ship to the rock with a single stroke, and shouted to my crew to row for their lives. As we sped away, the only sound breaking the frantic rhythm of our oars was the echo of my men's screams being slaughtered. Of my once proud fleet, only my black ship remained, a lone survivor fleeing from a saltwater grave. We sailed far from that nightmare land with shattered hearts. We were glad to have escaped death, yes, but we wept bitterly for the loss of so many dear companions. The silence on my ship was heavy, dense, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the oars and the muffled sobs of men who had seen too much horror. 11 ships, hundreds of friends and countrymen, erased from existence in the blink of an eye. We continued adrift, our spirits as battered as the hull of our lone surviving vessel. The sea, once a path home, now felt like an endless purgatory designed by a vengeful god. Eventually, we reached the shore of another island, Aea. Unlike the others, this one seemed cloaked in an unnatural silence. We anchored in a hidden cove, and for 2 days and 2 nights we remained there, consumed by fatigue and grief, too afraid to set foot on land. On the 3rd day, dawn found me gripping my spear and sword. Inaction would kill us slowly. I climbed a promontory to survey the island. I saw no signs of cultivated fields or livestock, only a dense and ancient forest stretching all the way to the sea. And at the center of it all, rising above the treetops, I saw a thin column of smoke. My heart wavered. Smoke meant civilization, but after the Laestrygonians, that word had lost all comfort. I returned to the ship, my mind a whirlwind. Should we take the risk, or flee and face starvation at sea? When they saw me, my men broke down. The sight of my eyes reminded them of the slaughter we had escaped, and they began to weep again, a desperate lament that tore at my soul. But leadership demands decisions, not tears. "Friends," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "we do not know this land. We do not know whether we'll meet men or monsters. Staying here means death. We must investigate." Seeing the fear in their eyes, I made a decision. We will divide the men we have left into 2 groups. I will lead one. The noble Eurylochus, my kinsman, will lead the other. We will draw lots to decide which group must take on the terrible task of following that trail of smoke and discovering our fate. We placed the lots into a bronze helmet and shook them. The lot of my brave kinsman Eurylochus was the first to leap out, and so he departed with his 22 companions, who followed him weeping. And we who remained on the shore wept as well, fearing we would never see them again. They ventured into the silent forest. In a valley they found the house of Circe, built from polished stones and visible from afar. Around the house roamed mountain wolves and lions, whom Circe herself had bewitched with her evil potions. But they did not attack my men. On the contrary, they rose up on their hind legs and fawned on them, wagging their long tails like dogs welcoming their master. The sight of these wild beasts behaving so unnaturally filled them with icy dread. They stopped at the threshold of the house, and from within they heard a voice, beautiful and enchanting. It was Circe, singing as she wove at a great immortal loom, her work delicate, radiant, and glorious, the kind only a goddess could create. The sound of that voice dispelled some of their fear. Polites, the most beloved and sensible of my men, was the first to speak. "Friends, someone is inside, a goddess or a woman, singing sweetly while she weaves. Let us call out to her now." So they shouted, and she came out at once. She opened the gleaming doors and welcomed them in with a charming smile. And all of them, in their foolishness and desperation to find shelter, followed her inside. Only Eurylochus remained behind. A deep instinct, a fear older than reason, warned him it was all a trap. He waited, hidden among the trees, his heart frozen in terror, as the stone doors closed behind his companions, sealing their fate within the sorceress's palace. Inside, Circe had them sit on splendid chairs and thrones. Then she prepared a mixture for them in golden bowls, cheese, barley meal, and pale honey, all blended with strong, dark Pramnian wine. But into this mixture she poured her wicked potions, drugs that would make them forget their homeland completely. Once they had all drunk every last drop, she struck them with her wand and said, "Now go to the styes and wallow with your new companions." Instantly, their bodies began to change. Bristles sprouted, their faces stretched into snouts, and hooves replaced their hands and feet. They were turned into pigs, with the form and grunts of swine, but their minds, to their eternal horror, remained human, trapped and aware within their vile new bodies. Weeping, they were driven to the pens, where Circe tossed acorns, beech mast, and cornel fruit to them, the typical fare of swine wallowing in the mud. Outside, Eurylochus waited for a long time. The silence grew heavy, unnatural. No one came out. The sun began to set, and a cold terror gripped him. Fearing the worst, he ran back to the ship, a messenger of disaster he did not yet fully understand. He arrived breathless, so overwhelmed by panic and sorrow that at first he could not speak. Tears streamed down his face as he pointed desperately toward the forest. "Odysseus," he finally managed to say, his voice broken. "They're gone, all of them. They entered a palace in the woods, drawn in by a song, and they haven't come out. It's a trap. We must flee now before that evil comes for us too." But Odysseus was not a king who abandoned his men. The pain of losing his comrades turned into cold fury. He slung over his shoulder his great bronze sword with silver studs, took up his bow, and ordered Eurylochus to guide him back. Eurylochus dropped to his knees, clutching Odysseus's legs and begging, "Don't go, my king, don't make me return there. It will be your death and ours. Let us flee with the men we still have." Odysseus looked at him with eyes of steel. "Then stay here. Eat and drink beside the black ship. But I will go. A mighty need drives me." And turning from him, he strode alone into the enchanted forest.
The path to Circe's palace was silent and grim. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Odysseus with every step. He was the last leader, the final hope for the men who had been turned into beasts. His mind raced, searching for a plan. But how could a mortal fight against the magic of a goddess? As he neared the valley, a youth of great beauty crossed his path, just as he was about to reach the sorceress's house. The young man carried a golden wand, and the first soft hairs of youth blossomed on his chin, an age of utmost charm. He took Odysseus by the hand with familiarity and spoke with a voice that seemed to know his deepest thoughts. "Poor man, where are you going alone through these hills, across unknown land? Your companions are locked in Circe's pens, transformed into swine. Do you come to free them? I tell you, you will not return. You will stay here with the others." Odysseus froze. Who was this youth who knew of his misfortune? "But no," the young man continued with a cunning smile. "I won't let you perish. I will save you. Take this herb of great power. With it you may enter Circe's palace and be shielded from her fatal day." He bent down and pulled a plant from the ground, holding it out and explaining its nature. "The root is black, but the flower is as white as milk. The gods call it moly. It is very difficult for mortal men to uproot, but the gods can do all things. It was Hermes, the messenger of the gods, sent by Zeus to aid him." "Listen closely to my instructions," said the god. "When Circe offers you her potion, slip this herb into it without her seeing. It will nullify her magic. When she strikes you with her long wand, draw your sharp sword and rush at her as if to kill her. She will be terrified and invite you to her bed. Do not refuse, for only then will she release your men. But first, make her swear the great oath of the blessed gods, that she will plot no more harm against you." With that, the god of the golden wand rose and vanished toward Olympus. Odysseus, his heart filled with newfound divine confidence and the magic herb in hand, continued on his way. The final confrontation with the enchantress was about to begin.
I arrived at the palace gates and knocked. Circe heard me, opened the gleaming doors, and invited me in with the same smile she had used to deceive my men. She led me inside and offered me a seat on a throne adorned with silver studs. Then she prepared her potion in a golden cup and offered it to me. As I took it, I secretly slipped the moly herb into the drink without her seeing. I drank it all in one gulp. The potion had no effect. Circe struck me with her wand and exclaimed, "Now go to your sty and wallow with the rest of your companions." But I did not transform. I drew the sharp sword from my thigh and lunged at her as if to kill her on the spot. She let out a sharp cry, dodged my blow, and fell to her knees, clutching at my legs with a look of terror and astonishment. "Who are you?" she sobbed. "Of what lineage? How is it that my magic has no power over you? No other mortal has ever resisted this potion. You must be Odysseus, master of many wiles, the one the messenger of the gods warned me would come one day in his black and swift ship. Sheathe your sword and come to my bed, so that, united in love, we may learn to trust one another." But I remembered Hermes' warning.
"Goddess," I replied, "I will not enter your bed until you swear the great oath of the blessed gods, that you will plot no further cruel harm against me." She swore the oath as I had asked. Only then did I lower my sword. Her maidens prepared a bath and a feast, but I remained seated, silent, my heart heavy with grief. Circe saw this and understood. "How could a just man enjoy a feast," I said to her, "knowing his companions suffer, turned into beasts?" Moved by my loyalty and bound by her oath, Circe took her wand and went to the pens. She opened the doors and anointed each of the pigs with another potion. And before my eyes, the bristles fell from their bodies, and they became men again, but younger, taller, and far more handsome than before. We recognized one another and embraced, weeping with joy and relief, and the sound of our happiness echoed throughout the palace. Smiling, Circe made us an offer. "Stay here with me, rest for a full year, regain your strength, and heal your hearts. The journey that awaits you is still long and dark."